The cabin stood like a lone sentinel in the heart of the forest, cloaked by towering pines and the whisper of the wind through ancient boughs. It was a simple structure, wooden and weathered, blending so seamlessly with its surroundings that one could easily pass by without noticing. Yet, within its modest walls lay a secret that could shatter worlds. She had chosen this place for its solitude, far from the watchful eyes of her pursuers and the endless noise of civilization. Here, amid the tangled web of nature, she found the closest semblance to peace she could manage. Her name was a complex series of syllables unpronounceable by human tongues, but for simplicity, she went by Lyra. And Lyra was far more than she appeared to be. To the untrained eye, she was a woman of breathtaking beauty, tall, lithe, with long silvery hair that shimmered like liquid starlight. Her skin was pale, with a faint, iridescent glow, and her eyes, those eyes, gleamed with an otherworldly light, a captivating hue that shifted between emerald and sapphire depending on the angle. She moved with an elegance that seemed almost inhuman, and for good reason. Lyra was no mere woman. She was one of the most feared assassins in the known universe, an apex predator in the guise of a goddess. Her kind was rare, feared, and respected. Bred for perfection and trained from infancy, Lyra had spent her life mastering the art of silent death. She was swift, efficient, and utterly ruthless. Yet, even the most skilled predator could find themselves on the run, and so here she was, in a forgotten corner of a planet that had barely begun to understand the vastness of the cosmos. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Lyra kept to the shadows, her existence blending into the backdrop of this untouched wilderness. She hunted for her sustenance, gathered what the forest provided, and maintained the cabin with an almost meditative diligence. There was a calm to her life here, but it was a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of her reality. For Lyra knew that peace was an illusion, and sooner or later, her past would catch up with her. It was on an unusually crisp autumn afternoon that her solitude was shattered. Michael Turner was not a man given to fear. A lifelong adventurer and wilderness guide, he had spent years exploring the far reaches of the world, drawn by the allure of the unknown and the promise of discovery. Yet, nothing in his varied experiences had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The dense forest had always felt like a second home to Michael. He reveled in the isolation, the serenity, and the challenge of navigating the untamed wilderness. This particular excursion had begun like many others, a week-long trek into the mountains, seeking solitude and the occasional inspiration for his nature photography. But as he ventured deeper into the woods, Michael noticed something unusual. There were subtle signs at first, disturbances in the underbrush, faint traces of movement that didn't match any animal he recognized. He chalked it up to his imagination, a product of the isolation and the ever-present whisper of the wind through the trees. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at the edges of his awareness, a shadow that refused to be ignored. On the fourth day, the weather turned colder, and with the change came a peculiar sense of urgency. Michael, ever the pragmatic survivalist, decided to head toward a cabin he knew was tucked away in this part of the forest, a place he had stumbled upon during a previous expedition. It was an old structure, long abandoned, or so he thought. It would serve as a temporary shelter from the biting wind and the approaching twilight. As he neared the clearing where the cabin stood, Michael's steps slowed. There was something different this time, an air of quiet tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The cabin was not as he remembered it. The wood, though aged, showed signs of recent care. The path leading to the door was swept clear, and the faint scent of burning wood drifted on the air. Someone was here. He approached cautiously, his boots barely making a sound on the forest floor. Reaching the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the worn handle. Michael took a deep breath, summoning the courage that had carried him through countless adventures, and knocked. The door opened before his knuckles could connect a second time. And there she stood. For a moment, Michael forgot to breathe. The woman before him was unlike anyone he had ever seen, strikingly beautiful, yet with an aura that spoke of something far more dangerous. Her eyes, captivating and unervingly intense, locked onto his, and in that instant, he felt as though he were being weighed, measured, and found wanting. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an edge of command that made it clear she was not one to be trifled with. Michael cleared his throat, fighting to regain his composure. "I'm Michael Turner." I was hiking through the forest and came across this cabin. I didn't mean to intrude. I just needed a place to stay for the night." Lyra tilted her head, scrutinizing him with a gaze that could pierce through lies like a blade through flesh. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "This cabin is occupied. You should move along." Her words were simple, but the implication was clear: he was not welcome. But something about her, the way she held herself, the undercurrent of something more in her tone, made Michael hesitate. Curiosity, mixed with a tinge of concern, rooted him to the spot. "I didn't realize anyone lived here," he said slowly. "I thought it was abandoned." "It isn't." Another pause, the tension thick in the air between them. Michael could sense that there was more to this woman than met the eye. She was no ordinary hermit living off the grid. There was a story here, one that tugged at the edges of his adventurous spirit. "Look," he began, carefully choosing his words. "I don't want any trouble. I'll be gone by morning. Just let me rest for the night, and I'll be out of your hair." Lyra's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse. But then she stepped aside, allowing him entry. "One night," she said. "No more." Michael nodded, stepping into the cabin, unaware that he had just walked into a web of secrets far more dangerous than any wilderness he had ever traversed. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Michael as he stepped inside, a stark contrast to the chill creeping through the forest. The interior was sparse but meticulously maintained. A small table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace crackling with a modest fire. It was clear that whoever lived here valued simplicity, yet there was an underlying precision to the arrangement, as though each item had been placed with deliberate care. Lyra moved with fluid grace, closing the door behind him and returning to the small hearth without a word. Her presence dominated the room, a silent but potent reminder that he was a guest, and perhaps an unwelcome one. Michael set down his pack near the door, his eyes subtly tracing the contours of the cabin, taking in every detail. "This place is impressive," he offered, attempting to break the silence. "I've seen it before, but it looks like you've really made it your own." She didn't respond immediately, her attention focused on tending the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. "It's functional. That's all that matters." Michael nodded, sensing that small talk would do little to soften her guarded demeanor. He glanced around, noting the absence of personal touches or belongings. It struck him as odd. Most people living in such isolation would have something to remind them of the outside world, a photograph, a memento. But here, there was nothing. "So, what brings you out here?" he asked, unable to quell his curiosity. Not many people choose to live this far from civilization. Lyra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I could ask you the same thing." Her deflection was clear, and Michael decided to tread carefully. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Fair enough. I'm just a traveler, looking for some peace and quiet." The mountains seemed like a good place to find it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "And you thought peace would be in a place like this?" Michael shrugged, trying to keep his tone light. "It's as good a place as any. Sometimes, the best way to clear your head is to get lost in nature." Lyra's gaze remained steady, as if she could see straight through him. "Getting lost can be dangerous. You never know what you might find." There was a weight to her words, an undercurrent that made Michael wonder just how much she was warning him, and how much she might be warning herself. He decided not to press further, sensing that any more questions would only raise her defenses higher. Instead, he shifted his focus to the practical. "Do you have enough food?" "I have some supplies in my pack. Maybe we could share a meal." Lyra hesitated, and for a moment, Michael thought she might refuse. But then she gave a small nod, turning back to the fire. "There's some stew. You can add what you have." Michael took it as a small victory and moved to his pack, pulling out a few provisions, dried meat, some vegetables, and spices. He approached the fire, offering the items to Lyra. She took them without a word, adding them to the pot hanging over the flames. The aroma of the stew began to fill the cabin, and Michael felt the tension ease, if only slightly. As they worked in silence, an unspoken truce settled between them. Michael could tell there was more to her story, a depth he couldn't yet fathom, but he wasn't sure if pushing would do more harm than good. For now, he would respect her boundaries and hope that time might soften her resolve. The night deepened, the forest outside cloaked in darkness, save for the pale glow of the moon filtering through the trees. Inside the cabin, the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating a dance of light and dark that seemed almost alive. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Michael savored the stew, the warmth of the food a welcome comfort after a long day of trekking through the forest. He watched Lyra out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way she ate with slow, deliberate movements, as if each bite was a ritual. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing to the stew. "Better than most people I know who live out here." Lyra glanced at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "You learn to make do with what you have." There was something in her tone, a hint of weariness, perhaps even loneliness, that made Michael pause. He wanted to ask more, to delve deeper into the enigma that was Lyra, but he knew better than to push too hard, too soon. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the fire. "Sometimes, I wonder what it would be like to live like this permanently. Just away from everything." Lyra's eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable once more. "It's not as simple as it seems. Isolation has a cost." Michael turned to meet her gaze, sensing the gravity of her words. "And you're willing to pay that cost?" For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes locked on his. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Sometimes, it's the only choice you have." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He realized then that Lyra wasn't just hiding from the world. She was hiding from something much more dangerous. Something or someone that made isolation not just a choice, but a necessity. And for the first time, Michael wondered if staying the night had been a mistake. Michael lay on the small cot Lyra had offered, though sleep eluded him. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow that barely pushed back the shadows gathering in the corners of the cabin. His thoughts churned, restless and uneasy. The forest, usually a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra was more than she seemed. Her beauty was otherworldly, yes, but it was her presence, the way she moved and spoke, that unsettled him the most. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind born from a life of constant vigilance. Michael had met his fair share of survivors, people who had endured unimaginable things, but none of them exuded the same intensity as Lyra. Turning onto his side, he caught a glimpse of her silhouette by the window. She stood perfectly still, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glass, as though expecting something, or someone. Michael's pulse quickened. He didn't know what kind of danger Lyra might be facing, but the possibility that it could spill over to him was becoming increasingly clear. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. Lyra didn't turn. "It's not always safe to sleep deeply." Her response sent a shiver down his spine. "Out here? What are you worried about?" "Animals." Her head tilted slightly, but she remained focused on the forest. "There are things more dangerous than animals." Michael sat up, rubbing his face. "Look, I don't want to pry, but if there's something out there that could be a threat, I think I have a right to know." Lyra finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, she seemed to consider his words, weighing whether or not to let him in on her secret. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost reluctant, she walked over and sat across from him. "You're right," she said quietly. "But what I'm hiding from, you won't believe me." Michael leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Try me." There was a long pause as Lyra searched his face, perhaps looking for a sign that he could handle the truth. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not from this world." Michael blinked, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "You mean, not from Earth?" She nodded, her gaze steady, waiting for the disbelief or laughter she had encountered before. But Michael, ever the adventurer, didn't dismiss her outright. He had seen too much, experienced too many strange things, to simply brush her off. "Okay," he said slowly, trying to process the revelation. "If you're not from Earth, where are you from? And why are you here?" Lyra's eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and caution. "I come from a place far beyond your galaxy. My people, we are highly skilled in many things, but I was trained for one purpose, to eliminate threats." Michael's mind raced. "An assassin?" She nodded again, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes. I was one of the best." He stared at her, the pieces slowly falling into place. "And now you're hiding. From your own people." "From them and others," she admitted. "I left because I refused to follow orders I believed were unjust. They don't take kindly to dissent." Michael exhaled sharply, leaning back against the wall. "So, you're saying that somewhere out there, people, no beings, are hunting you?" "Yes," Lyra said, her tone matter-of-fact. "And they will come, eventually. They always do." The weight of her words pressed down on him, but instead of fear, Michael felt something else, a strange mix of awe and protectiveness. This woman, this alien assassin, had chosen to run rather than continue a life of killing. It was a decision that carried a tremendous risk, yet she had made it anyway. "What happens when they find you?" he asked, his voice softer now. Lyra's expression hardened. "I fight. Or I run again. It's all I can do." Michael nodded, understanding the grim reality she faced. Yet, he couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her courage. "You don't have to do it alone, you know." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You'd help me? Knowing what I am." He met her gaze without flinching. "I've always believed that people, or beings, are more than just their pasts. You made a choice to walk away from that life. That says a lot about you." For the first time, Lyra's demeanor softened, and a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Maybe not," Michael admitted. "But I've always been drawn to the unknown. And right now, the unknown is sitting across from me, asking me to believe in something incredible." Lyra regarded him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut string. Then, she gave a small nod, as if accepting an unspoken pact. "Very well," she said. "But know this. If they come, there will be no mercy." Michael nodded. "Understood." The fire crackled softly, and for a moment, the tension lifted, replaced by a fragile alliance between a man and an alien assassin, bound by circumstance and the hope of survival. The fragile truce between Michael and Lyra lingered in the cabin as the night stretched on, thick with the scent of burnt wood and the faint rustle of the forest outside. Despite the weight of her confession, Lyra's demeanor remained composed, though her eyes never stopped scanning the room, as if expecting the shadows to shift and reveal her hunters at any moment. Michael lay back on the cot, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just learned. An alien assassin, hiding out in the wilderness, hunted by beings from another galaxy. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Yet here she was, as real and present as the walls around him. "You said they always come," Michael murmured, breaking the silence. "How much time do we have?" Lyra's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. "It's hard to say. They have ways of tracking, but the forest and the isolation have slowed them down before. That's why I chose this place. It's harder for them to find me here." Michael frowned. "But they will eventually?" She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes. They're relentless. And once they have a trail, they won't stop until they catch me." A chill ran down Michael's spine. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "So, what's the plan? Do we wait for them to come here, or do you have somewhere else to go?" Lyra crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "There's nowhere else. Moving too often increases the risk of exposure. Here, I can monitor the area and control the environment. It's a strategic advantage." "Strategic," Michael repeated, tasting the word. It made sense, coming from someone with her background. But strategy or not, it felt like they were sitting on a powder keg, waiting for a spark. "And when they get here?" Lyra's eyes hardened, and for a moment, the assassin within her surfaced. "I fight." Her tone was cold, final, and it sent a wave of apprehension through Michael. He had seen combat before, survival situations, encounters with dangerous wildlife, but this was a different level. This was a battle between beings far beyond his understanding, and he was suddenly aware of how out of his depth he was. Yet, despite the danger, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. There was something about Lyra that compelled him to stay, a mix of fascination, respect, and a sense of duty he couldn't quite explain. "I'll help," he said, the words surprising even himself. Lyra raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in her gaze. "Help? You don't know what you're up against." Michael shrugged, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe not. But I know this forest, and I know how to survive. That's got to count for something." For a moment, Lyra said nothing. Her eyes locked on his as if searching for any sign of weakness or doubt. Then, to his surprise, she gave a slight nod. "It might," she admitted. "If you're serious about staying, there are things you need to know. This isn't just about fighting. It's about understanding what's coming." Michael leaned forward, the intensity of her gaze pulling him in. "Then tell me. Teach me what I need to know." Lyra straightened, her posture shifting into something more formal, almost like a commander briefing a soldier. "First, you need to understand who they are. The ones hunting me are part of a collective, a coalition of species that enforce their laws across multiple systems. They're efficient, highly trained, and they use advanced technology far beyond what humans have developed." Michael nodded, absorbing the information. "And you? How do you fit into all this?" "I was one of them once," Lyra said quietly. "A part of their elite force, used to neutralize high-threat targets. But I saw things that made me question their methods. Their justice isn't justice. It's control. And when I refused to continue, they marked me as a traitor." Her voice was steady, but Michael could hear the underlying bitterness, the weight of betrayal that still clung to her words. He couldn't imagine the kind of life she had led, the choices she had to make, but he understood enough to know it had cost her everything. "And now, they're hunting you because you wouldn't follow orders," he said, his tone laced with sympathy. "Yes," Lyra confirmed. "To them, I'm a loose end. A danger that needs to be eliminated." Michael exhaled slowly, the gravity of the situation settling over him. "So, we prepare for when they come. Fortify the cabin, set traps, and use the terrain to our advantage." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, one that hinted at approval. "You catch on quickly." Michael chuckled, though it was devoid of humor. "I've always been a fast learner. Especially when my life depends on it." Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were two very different beings, brought together by circumstances neither could have predicted, but united by the common goal of survival. The night stretched on, but for the first time since Michael had arrived, the oppressive weight of the unknown felt just a little lighter. Together, they would face whatever came, and in the stillness of the forest, they began to prepare for the storm that was surely brewing on the horizon. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. The forest, once a place of serene beauty, became a fortress under Lyra's guidance. She moved with precision, identifying the best vantage points, natural barriers, and chokeholds where an ambush might turn the tide in their favor. Michael followed her lead, his knowledge of the terrain complementing her tactical expertise. Together, they reinforced the cabin, securing windows with heavy wooden shutters and fortifying the door with sturdy beams. Outside, they set traps, simple snares for detection, and more elaborate mechanisms designed to slow or injure anyone who ventured too close without caution. Michael was impressed by Lyra's ingenuity, her ability to turn the wilderness into a weapon. Yet, beneath his admiration, there was a growing unease. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen when Lyra's hunters arrived. Would their defenses hold? And if not, what then? One afternoon, as they worked side by side to camouflage a pit trap near the cabin's perimeter, Michael finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "What happens if they're stronger than we expect?" he asked, his hands covered in dirt as he packed the edges of the pit with foliage. Lyra paused, her silver hair catching the dappled sunlight as she turned to him. "They will be strong. That's not a question. But strength isn't everything. We have the advantage of terrain, surprise, and strategy. Michael nodded, though her answer didn't entirely quell his concern. And if it's not enough? Lyra's gaze softened, a rare moment of vulnerability slipping through her stoic exterior. Then we fight until we can't. That's all we can do. There was a finality in her words that sent a shiver down his spine. Michael swallowed hard, wiping his hands on his pants as he stood. And you've done this before? Fought them off like this? Not exactly like this, Lyra admitted. But I've been in similar situations. The key is to stay ahead of them, to keep them guessing. Her calm, methodical approach was both reassuring and disconcerting. She had lived a life of constant battle, and it showed in every calculated move she made. Michael couldn't imagine the toll it must have taken on her, the weight of always being hunted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they finished the trap and made their way back to the cabin. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Michael felt the tension in his muscles, a mix of exhaustion and anticipation, knowing that every step brought them closer to an inevitable confrontation. Inside, the cabin felt more like a bunker than a home. The fire crackled softly, and they sat across from each other, sharing a meal in relative silence. Michael could see the weariness in Lyra's eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden. "You've been running for a long time," he said, breaking the silence. Lyra looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Longer than I care to remember. Don't you ever think about stopping? Finding a place where they can't reach you?" She shook her head slowly. "There's no such place. They have eyes everywhere, resources beyond what you can imagine. The only way to truly stop running is to make a stand." Michael leaned back, his gaze steady on her. "And you think this is the place to make that stand?" Lyra's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's just another stop along the way." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Michael felt a pang of empathy for her, this woman who had spent her life in the shadows, always looking over her shoulder. "You're not alone now," he said softly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, the wall she had built around herself seemed to waver. "Thank you, Michael." The simple words carried a depth of meaning, a rare glimpse into the person behind the assassin's mask. Michael nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever lay ahead, they would confront it as a team, bound by trust and the unyielding drive to survive. As the night deepened, the forest around them fell into a hushed stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. And in that silence, they waited, ready for whatever came next. The days passed with an oppressive weight, each one bringing a growing tension that settled deep into Michael's bones. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt like a predator lying in wait, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig heightening his senses. Lyra remained vigilant, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her body ever poised for action. They had done everything they could to prepare, reinforcing the cabin, setting traps, and planning for every possible contingency. Yet, despite their efforts, the unknown loomed over them like a dark cloud. On the seventh night, it came. The first sign was subtle, a shift in the air, a faint hum that vibrated just at the edge of perception. Lyra, standing by the window, stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the distant tree lean. "They're here," she whispered. Michael, who had been dozing by the fire, shot to his feet, adrenaline flooding his system. "How many?" Lyra's jaw tightened. "Enough." They moved swiftly, slipping into the roles they had prepared for. Lyra took her place by the door, her body coiled with the energy of a predator ready to strike. Michael, heart pounding, grabbed the rifle they had kept as a last resort. It felt heavy in his hands, the weight a reminder of what was at stake. The hum grew louder, transforming into a low, mechanical whine. Moments later, the trees at the edge of the clearing parted, and they saw them, figures cloaked in dark armor, their faces obscured by visors that gleamed in the moonlight. There were 5, maybe 6, moving in perfect synchronization, their weapons held at the ready. Lyra's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Remember the plan. We draw them in, make them believe they have the upper hand." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "Got it." The first trap triggered as the intruders crossed the perimeter, a snare snapping up one of the figures and hoisting them into the air. It bought them a few precious seconds, but the others responded with cold efficiency, fanning out to encircle the cabin. Lyra moved like lightning, her form a blur as she darted out of the door, a knife flashing in her hand. She struck with precision, taking down one of the attackers before disappearing into the shadows. Michael watched in awe and terror, knowing that every second counted. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the forest. Michael returned fire, aiming to slow their advance. His heart pounded in his chest, each shot a desperate attempt to protect the fragile alliance he had formed with Lyra. The battle was chaos, flashes of light, the acrid smell of burning ozone, the metallic clang of weapons clashing. Lyra was a force of nature, her movements almost too fast to follow. She weaved between the attackers, her blade finding its mark with lethal precision. But for every one she took down, another seemed to rise in their place. Michael's mind raced, searching for a way to tip the scales. The traps had slowed them, yes, but it wasn't enough. They needed something more, something unexpected. Then it hit him, the fire. "Lyra," he shouted, ducking behind cover as a shot whizzed past his ear. "The fire. We can use it." She understood instantly, her eyes flashing with realization. In a single fluid motion, she pivoted, tossing a small incendiary device into the clearing. It ignited on impact, flames roaring to life and spreading rapidly through the dry underbrush. The attackers faltered, momentarily thrown off balance by the sudden blaze. It was the opening they needed. Michael surged forward, his rifle trained on the nearest figure. He squeezed the trigger, the shot finding its mark, and the figure crumpled to the ground. Lyra seized the moment, her form a whirlwind of motion as she closed in on the remaining enemies, dispatching them with ruthless efficiency. The fire grew, casting eerie shadows as it consumed the clearing. The remaining attackers, realizing they were outmatched and outmaneuvered, began to retreat, their movements swift and silent as they vanished into the forest. For a long moment, there was silence, save for the crackling of flames. Michael stood in the clearing, his chest heaving, the rifle heavy in his hands. Lyra emerged from the shadows, blood spattered across her face, her expression unreadable. "It's over," she said quietly, though there was no relief in her voice. Michael lowered the rifle, his hands trembling. "For now." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the burning forest, already anticipating the next battle, the next chase. "They'll come again." Michael stepped closer, his voice steady despite the fear still coursing through him. "Then we'll be ready." Lyra turned to him, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. "Together." "Together," Michael affirmed. The firelight danced in their eyes, a flickering beacon of resilience in the face of the unknown. And as the flames continued to burn, they stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, bound by trust and the unbreakable will to survive.